Hello and welcome back, sleepywhatsit here with another miniatures video. In today's video we're going to be doing a paint along covering a beginner's guide to painting Deathwatch Space Marines. This video is going to be similar in structure to my previous Space Marine painting videos, so we're going to go through the very beginner-friendly painting scheme, and then we're going to do some improvements on it if we want to take that paint job up a notch or two. Since this is a beginner-focused video, I'm going to be using a limited palette of Citadel paints, mostly those that are available in their various starter kits, along with a few additional ones, but we'll be using some mostly basic techniques, and we're going to be focusing on getting a solid tabletop paint job and not trying to do something more elaborate. If you haven't seen my paint-along videos before, I put markers like these to indicate points where you can pause and replicate the steps that I just discussed. I'm not going to go through the process of assembling the model or priming it, since I've covered that in a number of previous videos, some of which I will put up a card for now and a link down below so you can go review those if you need to. So I am going to assume that you're starting with an assembled and primed model. Depending on the specific model you're using, you may or may not want to fully attach things like the arms holding bolters and such to allow access to obscure details and things like that. This truly is a moment of do as I say, not as I do, since the arms are fully attached on this specific model. Even though I am starting with a black prime on my model here, I am going to be base coating using Abaddon Black. This is because if we need to make any corrections later, it'll be easier to paint match using a thinner base paint than trying to apply thick primer. Also, base paint and primer have slightly different finishes, so to keep them kind of all in the same family, we want to get everything primed or undercoated using Abaddon Black. For this, we're just going to coat the entire model. If you start out with a black primer, then you'll probably only need one thin coat to do this, since it's going to be black showing through black. If you're starting through with another color of primer, you may need more than one layer to get complete coverage. Since we're using this undercoat for a large portion of the armor, you will want to make sure that you have good coverage. You should pause the video now and get your model assembled, primed, and undercoated. So here's my model with the undercoat down. Amazingly, it still looks like you haven't unlocked this fighter. I'm pretty sure I've made that joke before in another video. I apologize. Anyway, the first element that we're going to be painting on this model is the iconic Deathwatch metallic left arm. If you have the upgrade sprue for these models, possibly from the patrol box, then you will have a more detailed arm to work with here, but the approach that I'm going to be showing you in this video should be applicable even to that arm. For this color, we're going to want to end up with getting a gray metallic with a bit of a blue hue to it. So the first color that we're going to be painting on the arm is Leadbelcher, which is a dark gray metallic from GW. If you have a mix of new and older brushes, I recommend using your older brushes when working with metallic paints, since flakes can wear down the bristles significantly, so you don't really want to prematurely age your best brushes. You are going to want to paint the entire arm, hand, and shoulder using two thin coats to get good coverage that's still smooth. After we have this base coat down, we'll need to let it dry for a moment before we begin shading. For shading this blue metallic, I'm going to be using Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a dark blue / indigo wash. This will help darken the shadows of the armor, but stain things a touch blue. If you don't have this shade, you can make a wash using water to thin it down, to thin down a mix of black and blue paint to get to the right consistency. For example, for paints, you could use Abaddon Black and MacLeod Blue. I don't have specific ratios, you kind of will have to just eyeball it. I actually hit the entire model with my blue shade to give it a touch of blue to the black areas, though I'm not 100% sold that this was the right choice, since the black armor definitely ended up being a touch more dark black instead of just black in the end. It'll take a bit of time for this shade to dry, so I'd recommend working on other models for like 15 minutes while it's drying to avoid pulling up any paint. Once the shade is dried, we're going to need to brighten up some of the high points of the arm again. For this, we're just going to be dry brushing using our base color, Leadbelcher. You're going to want to use a flat bristle brush for this. Load up some paint on the tip, work it into the bristles a bit on some paper towel, until brushing against the paper it only leaves a light dusting of metallic paint. You're then going to want to tickle the model with the brush, just slightly brushing it, trying to just catch the high areas and points, and leaving a little bit of bright paint down. You don't want to be like mashing it down into the details. If you prefer, you can use layering here for your highlighting, which you'll have more control over, but definitely will take a bit more time. So with that, we have the beginner's version of our blue-hued arm completed. You can pause the video now and go paint your metallic arm on the model. So here's how my model looks with the arm completed. The next area that we're going to focus on is all of the black power armor on our model. Conveniently, since we undercoated using Abaddon Black, we have our base color done here. Black as a model color can be sometimes problematic for large areas, since by definition it really doesn't show a lot of contrast, and thus it's hard to make details pop. Thus, we're going to need to introduce some artificial contrast for the details to show. We could do this using a large number of layers, using layer highlighting, getting progressively brighter in shades of gray, but A, that takes a lot of time, B, requires a very steady hand, and C, if we're using a neutral gray, it's going to look kind of warm in comparison to that blue metallic arm we just did. So instead of painstakingly edge highlighting, we're going to be returning to good old dry brushing. The specific color that we're going to be using is Dark Reaper, which is a very dark blue. It is going to be the same basic procedure for dry brushing, loading, unloading, brush, then lightly tickling the model. You're going to want to think about how the light would be hitting the model from above, focusing on hitting surfaces and edges that are more facing upwards than, so you can focus on doing like more top to bottom strokes as opposed to stroking up from the bottom of the model. Personally, I probably went a little bit heavy-handed here with the paint because I got a lot of Dark Reaper on non-lit surfaces. Thus, my model has a very dark blue look instead of a black with blue highlights. I like how it looks, so I'm not going to go back and correct it, since I'm not actually trying to like color match to an entire Deathwatch army or anything like that. You should pause the video here and highlight your black armor on your Space Marine, trying not to get too much paint onto the arm because you'll have to go clean that up after. Here's my model with the arm and armor completed, so let's just call this done and go on with it, or we could actually finish it. But before we move on, we're going to re-blacken some key areas, specifically things like the joint ribbings on like the back of the knees and the elbows. The right knee pad it will need to be turned black, and anywhere that we're going to be painting metallic paints, obviously other than the arm that we already painted. So take some time to clean up your black areas and before we move on. Now that we have all that black touched up, we need to base out our other colors. For the red on the knee pad and the bolter, I'm going to be using Khorne Red, which is a darker red tone. If you only have something like Mephiston Red from a starter kit, that'll work perfectly fine. It's just going to be a touch more vibrant. I also painted the lenses of the helmet with this red color. For the belt and pouch leather, I used Rhinox Hide to get a nice dark brown. For the gray metallic areas, like elements of the bolter, the Aquila on the chest, the vents on the helmet, and those pipes on the backpack, I based them out using Leadbelcher. Also for the skull on the Aquila, after I did the Leadbelcher layer, I used a little bit of Retributor Armour to paint just the skull gold. With all these base layers painted and dried, I went in and shaded all these areas. For this, I'm using a black wash, specifically Nuln Oil, to shade things. After letting all of that wash dry, we need to brighten all this back up using the base paint colors that we used. So we're just doing layering on the top elements that are facing kind of the sky and any hard edges, and just really trying to focus on avoiding going into the dark recesses and undersides and just making little details pop going over the entire model. You can pause now and paint all of the other colors that you need to paint on your model. After completing the main Deathwatch paint scheme, we're going to need to paint that right shoulder pad to indicate what chapter they came from. You can choose whatever Loyalist chapter you want for your shoulder pad. I went with Ultramarines since the blue will hopefully force visually my armor to read a little bit more black than blue. Also, I have tons of Ultramarines transfers because they come in like every box I'm probably never going to use since I'm never building an Ultramarines army. If you're looking for details on how to paint a shoulder for a specific chapter, I have done a few videos on that, and I'll be doing more in the future for examples. But basically pick the shoulder you want to do and go give her a try. You can pause the video now while you go do that. And with that, we've completed a basic tabletop paint scheme on this intercessor. It's clear they're a member of the Deathwatch, and they should read pretty well on the table. Not going to win any competitions with them, but there's something that I wouldn't mind having, like a squad of these guys for kill team or something. There's a couple of ways, though, that we can take this paint scheme up a notch. The first thing we're going to be doing is painting some additional brighter highlights on the model. For the armor, we're going to be using a Fenrisian Grey, which is a light blue gray. I would consider also using a slightly darker blue-gray for this highlight, something like the Fang or Rust Gray, since if you go a little bit too hard with this, you can make your model look very Tron-like, having such a light highlight over black. To preserve the black tone, but to define the shapes, we don't want to be doing like a standard layering highlight that you would do where you start on like the top of a surface, but we're going to be focusing on more, but basically we're going to be edge highlighting mostly here. So we're going to be going along the hard edges of the armor, so none of the soft curved edges. For the blue metallic arm and the other gray metallics, though, we are going to be doing layering highlighting using Runefang Steel, which again is just we're going to be focusing on hitting smaller sections of the top elements that we've previously done and making sure that any hard edges pop very nicely. For the gold on the skull, I just used a touch of Auric Armor Gold just on the top to make it pop a little bit more. Honestly, you could probably skip that and you wouldn't notice the difference. And then for the red elements on the model, like the bolter, the stripe on the kneecap, and the lenses, I used Mephiston Red as my highlight since I started with Khorne Red. Now that we've bumped up all the highlights on the model to increase the contrast, we're going to need to reinforce some of the shadowed regions. We're going to do this using blacklining. The high-level process for this is to run thin black lines through the deepest recesses and any cracks and along boundaries between colors, all to deepen the shadows and define regions better. You can do this using something like an acrylic artistic ink if you're wanting a more stylized illustrative look because of how strong they are, but normally something like a black wash like Nuln Oil works really well for getting a more subtle, natural look to it. You're kind of going to want to be using these black lines to counterbalance any type of edge highlighting you did on the armor plates. So basically anywhere you ran an edge highlight, there should be a corresponding black line that runs under it to kind of define more clearly where it is. If you have a more dark blue versus black armor like I do, all of the seams and such on the legs are definitely a good thing, the black line, to make them pop out. For color boundaries, the black to dark blue, like between the back of the knee and the armor and such, isn't really an essential to hit item just because there isn't that much distinction there. But for things like around the Aquila on the chest and the bolter are really good areas to hit, around the fingers holding the bolter and things like that, just to make sure those details strongly, so they don't just kind of blend together. Anyway, you should pause now and go blackline your model to your heart's desire. With the blacklining done, the paint job on the model is complete. If you're painting an upgraded version of this model, you're going to have some minor differences, but the basic colors that you're going to be using are going to be the same. For any embossed details where you have the eye with a skull in it, like on I think it's the Inquisition symbol, you're going to want to follow the same basic scheme that we did on the Aquila, basing out using metallic gray and then painting over the skull using gold. Depending on how fancy and how finished you want your paint job to go, there may be appropriate water slide transfers that you could be applying to things like knee pads and such, and you'll probably need to apply one of those for your shoulder to indicate the previous chapter for your Deathwatch Space Marine. But other than that, that should be all of it. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you did, please give this video a like. If you want to see more videos like this on miniatures painting, reviews of things, please subscribe to the channel. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.